Good day, all. This talk will explain how subjectivism works by providing a history of this theoretical tradition and explaining its basic concepts and ideas. As the name implies, subjectivism consists of those theories that focus on the subjective side of society, in other words, on what people think. Like sociology in general, subjectivism evolved from 18th and 19th century European philosophy, which spent a lot of time trying to understand the nature of subjectivity and the relationship between the subjective and the objective. In the early 18th century, English philosopher John Locke argued that the subjective mind can never truly know the objective world. This is because the mind cannot experience reality directly. All that the mind can ever know is the information brought to it by our senses, which these days are termed sense data. We form opinions about reality based on this information, but they're just subjective opinions. Objective reality could be quite different. This is an idea which was dramatically illustrated in the 1999 movie The Matrix. In this movie, people subjectively think that they're going about their business in a world much like ours, but their objective reality is that they're lying in pods being electronically fed the computer-generated images that make up the world of The Matrix. Now, The Matrix is science fiction. We can't create such a convincing computer-generated world yet. But, given the advances being made in virtual reality, it's surely only a matter of time. New technology is blurring the line between subjective and objective in ways that Locke could never have dreamed of. In the late 18th century, German philosopher Immanuel Kant built on Locke's ideas. Kant argued that our senses only bring us information about the surface appearances of things, which he termed phenomena, but not about their underlying reality, which he termed noumena. Only religion can give us an understanding of noumenal things like the soul or God, but science can still give us useful information about the phenomenal world. Through science, the mind imposes order on sense data, and this order is not arbitrary. Rather, Kant argued that the mind contains certain built-in or a priori forms of thought, organizing principles, and conceptual categories, which it uses to impose order and meaning onto sensory information. In short, to make sense out of sense data. Human reason pre-exists experience and orders experience, which for Kant makes it transcendent. In the early 19th century, this idea was taken up by the German philosopher Georg Hegel in his theory of idealism. Like Kant, Hegel drew on a combination of philosophy, religion, and science. He argued that the universe as a whole should be conceived of as a unity, which he referred to as the absolute, a concept which was basically the philosophical equivalent of God. The absolute is constantly striving to realize its potential or complete itself. It does this subjectively through the self-realization of the spirit or mind. Human progress is primarily about improving our self-awareness, which includes our understanding of ourselves and of the universe in general. Both religion and science can help us to improve that understanding. According to idealism, it is the rise of new ideas and a better understanding of how the universe works, which provide the impetus for social change and social evolution. As we understand the world better, we make society work better. This idealist model of history has been criticized for being, well, overly idealistic. Certainly, social history is partly about introducing gradual improvements. But it's also about violence, war, revolution, oppression, and the whole dark side of humanity. Karl Marx was explicitly taking issue with Hegel when he wrote that not ideas, but revolution is the driving force of history. However, despite Marx's opposition, idealism became the leading school of philosophy in 19th century Germany. Subjectivism was primarily brought into sociology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by two German theorists whose background was in philosophy and who were close friends. Max Weber, who lived from 1864 to 1920, and Georg Simmel, who lived from 1858 to 1918. Both included objective as well as subjective factors in their analyses, but the main contributions of both theorists were in subjective areas. Weber is best known for his work on religion, status, rationality, and bureaucracy, and for his methodology of Verstehen, which argues that in order to understand people's actions, we must come to understand their understanding of their situation, and we must understand their motivations. Simmel is best known for his work on culture, social relationships, social types, and individual consciousness. Again, all subjective factors. Weber's best-known work is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, published in 1905, in which he argued that the Protestant work ethic provided the spirit or religious motivation for the rise of capitalism. Simmel's best-known work is The Philosophy of Money, published in 1907, in which he argued that money had made human relationships more impersonal and so had alienated people from each other. American Robert Park went to Germany and studied under Simmel, then brought his ideas to the US in the 1890s, when he became one of the founding members of the first sociology department in North America at the University of Chicago. This department was very influential on early North American sociology, and its members became collectively known as the Chicago School. The Chicago School was instrumental in turning sociology from a branch of philosophy into a science. They backed up their theories with social statistics and with empirical observation. They used the city of Chicago as a case study in the field of urban sociology, focusing on the rise of ethnic neighborhood subcultures as waves of migrants came to the US from different countries. Most notably, in 1918, W.I. Thomas and Florian Znaniecki published The Polish Peasant in Europe and America, examining migration from Poland to Chicago, which was heavy at that time. This text was based on 8 years of compiling data, and it is generally considered to be the first significant work of empirical sociology published in North America. However, despite his use of objective facts, Thomas' main interest remained on the subjective. He argued that people always act on the basis of their subjective understanding of their circumstances, or their definition of the situation, as he termed it. And he is best known for proposing the Thomas theorem, which states, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. I would update the Thomas theorem, and put it in less sexist terms as follows. Subjective definitions have objective consequences. I shall provide examples of this as we proceed. Charles Horton Cooley became associated with the Chicago School, even though he was at the University of Michigan. Cooley looked at how children develop a sense of self. He argued that we're all born knowing nothing about ourselves, and that one of the first things we all have to do is develop a self-image. We have to figure out who we are. But how? Well, said Cooley, every child has to develop what he called the looking glass self. A looking glass is just an old-fashioned term for a mirror. Cooley's argument is that children use adults as mirrors in which to see their own reflection. Every child quickly learns that adults know much more than they do. Adults are authority figures, and young children generally believe whatever adults tell them. This changes, of course, as they grow older, but Cooley's talking about young children. Young children generally accept adults' opinions, especially those of their parents, as true. So, all children try to figure out what their parents think of them. Their self-image is primarily based on what they think their parents think of them. This is why it is so important for parents to encourage their children. If parents regularly tell their child, "Well done, you did a really good job there, you're so smart, you'll go far," then the child sees that its parents have a positive image of him or her, and so they develop a positive self-image. But if parents tell their child, "You're useless, you're clumsy, you're stupid, you'll never amount to anything," then the child develops a negative self-image. And this matters because people act on the basis of their self-image. A positive self-image gives you high self-esteem and the confidence to try to achieve things in life. You might not achieve everything you try for, but you will surely achieve something. A negative self-image gives you low self-esteem and the belief that whatever you try, you're bound to fail. If you believe that, then you don't even really try to succeed. So, of course, you do fail. This is what is termed a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is a prophecy that comes true because you made it. If adults tell the child he's going to be a failure and the child believes it, then he figures there's no point in even trying to succeed, and he does become a failure. Each person's subjective self-image shapes their objective actions and the objective course of their lives. George Herbert Mead, also of the Chicago School, built on Cooley's work. Mead argued that the self is a social structure. Just like a business, a government, or any other social organization, the self must be built up gradually through a process of social interaction and symbolic interaction. Mead argued that one thing that distinguishes humans from animals is that only humans engage in a process of reflection. Only humans think about themselves and form a self-image. But in order to do that, you have to learn to, so to speak, step outside yourself and look at yourself from the outside, from the other person's point of view, or from society's point of view. The subject must learn to think of themselves as an object. Little kids only think about what they want. This is not because they're greedy or selfish. It's because it takes time to learn how to see the other person's point of view. Seeing the world from your point of view comes naturally. But seeing the world, including yourself, from the other person's point of view is something that society must teach you. For this reason, said Mead, the self has two components, which he called I and me. I, the subject, must learn to think about me, the object. Everyone is born with their own consciousness, which Mead calls I. I am spontaneous and instinctive, and I just want to do whatever pops into my head. But society says, I can't do that. Society says, I not only have to follow its rules, I have to learn and internalize those rules. I have to make society's rules part of me. I have to do what is right, not just because society says so, but because I have made society's morality part of my personal conscience. Society invented morality to allow people to get along, and society teaches morality to every child, thereby triggering the creation of me. Me is the part of the self that comes to us from society, but that we have made part of ourselves. Or in other words, I engage in a dialogue with society, which creates me. Moreover, in order to understand yourself, you must understand your place in society. And to understand that, you must have some understanding of society. So, your understanding of yourself and your understanding of society develop together. Individual identity is closely tied to social identity. Each person's sense of self or self-image is not created by them alone. It is created by them interacting with society. At Columbia University in the 1930s, Frank Tannenbaum examined the development of self-image among juvenile delinquents, these days termed young offenders. He argued that a criminal self-image was developed as a process of interaction between teenagers and the authorities. He argued that normal, youthful high spirits often lead teens to disturb the peace of adults who call the law. The teens are arrested and put through a process that Tannenbaum called the dramatization of evil. The authorities make a big deal out of what the kid has done with all kinds of official proceedings. Suddenly he's got police and lawyers and judges and maybe also his parents, all telling him what an evil person he is. Now, for some kids, the result of all this will be that they are what these days is called scared straight, meaning that they're so scared by the whole thing that they never commit another crime. But some kids will believe it. They'll believe that if all these authority figures are saying that he's an evil person who's bound to grow up to become a criminal, then they must be right. The teen forms a criminal self-image and sets out on a life of crime. Then when he does, the policeman who arrested him says, "Ah, yes, I knew it all along. I knew he was a bad apple as soon as I laid eyes on him." But actually, it is the policeman and, more broadly, the justice system who have created a self-fulfilling prophecy, turning the teen into a criminal by defining him as such. This situation is an example of how subjective definitions have objective consequences. If you define the child as a criminal, they can become a criminal. Definitions shape your life, both how you define yourself, your self-image, and how others define you. A criminal self-image can make a young offender become an adult defendant in court. In a courtroom, the emphasis shifts to how others define you. The judge and jury decide whether to define the defendant as guilty or not guilty. If they define him as not guilty, he goes home. If they define him as guilty, he goes to jail. What ultimately matters in this situation is not whether the defendant objectively committed the crime. What matters is whether the judge and jury subjectively think he committed the crime. Now, obviously, physical evidence and objective facts enter into this decision. But in the real world, facts are rarely as conclusive as they are on TV. Witnesses disagree. Lawyers make good arguments for both sides. And subjective factors start to enter into the decision, such as bias. Juries can be biased against a defendant for any number of reasons, such as that they just don't like the look of his face. But the most common bias is, of course, a racial or ethnic bias. The sad fact is that in the US, white juries tend to automatically assume that all black defendants are guilty, and in Canada, white juries tend to automatically assume that all indigenous defendants are guilty. This is why America's jails are full of blacks and Canada's jails are full of indigenous people. Not because these ethnic groups commit so much more crime than whites, but because the larger white society defines them in negative terms, sees them as criminals, and so treats them as criminals. Subjective definitions have objective consequences not just for individuals, but on a social scale. After these theorists who concentrated on the development of the self in childhood, came theorists who focused on the self in adulthood, such as Erving Goffman. Goffman was born in Alberta, but graduated from the University of Chicago in the 1950s, remained in the US, and so became part of what was called the Second Chicago School. Goffman argued that whenever people interact, they engage in a process of presentation of self, meaning that they present a particular self-image to the people they're interacting with, their audience. For Goffman, the self only arises in a process of interaction between actor and audience. As actors play their roles, they engage in impression management, meaning they try to manage the impression they're making so as to make a good impression. Goffman says we do this partly because we generally want other people to like us, but more importantly because we can't effectively play our roles, including our jobs, unless other people accept us in those roles and agree to interact with us. For that to happen, we have to give the impression that we are competent, that we know how to play our role properly. If we make a bad impression, we can be stigmatized, which is basically society's way of saying there's something wrong with us, and then other people will not want to interact with us. Goffman developed this approach into dramaturgical theory, which says that people play social roles in much the same way that actors play theatrical roles in a drama. He drew a number of comparisons between theatrical roles and social roles, arguing that in both cases the actor must create a persona or self-image which they present to their audience, that both types of roles have a front stage where you perform and a backstage where you relax and rehearse, that in both cases you try to get the audience on your side so that they will overlook any minor mistakes you make and maybe even help you out, and so on. Goffman was criticized on the grounds that his model portrayed the underlying self or human nature as very cynical and manipulative, just putting on different masks for different audiences, always playing a part. Goffman replied that the problem is not with the individual, it is with a society that creates contradictory roles and forces us to create a variety of self-images. Also, in his later years, Goffman decided that he had overestimated the degree to which role-playing is performed creatively by the actor in negotiation with the audience, and that in practice role-playing mostly just consists of following established social rules, routines, and rituals. Over time, Goffman came to focus less on the individual and more on social structures. Social structures are larger and more powerful than the individual, so the individual must fit into them and has only a limited amount of freedom to individualize their role-playing. Goffman came to see that the micro can only be understood in the context of the macro. At the micro or individual level, subjectivism, as we've seen so far, focuses on the self. At the macro or cultural level, subjectivism focuses on meaning. Meaning was also a central focus of the Chicago School. The Thomas theorem is about definitions or meanings. And in the 1930s, Herbert Blumer put together the Chicago School's ideas about meaning into a theory which he called Symbolic Interactionism. This is based on three theoretical premises. First, people act towards things on the basis of the meaning which those things have for them. Second, those meanings are shared meanings, which are created through a process of symbolic interaction with other people. And third, as people's life circumstances change, they constantly engage in an internal dialogue to reinterpret and redefine the meanings that they hold. So, for Blumer, meaning is the most important aspect of society because everything that people do is based on the meanings that they hold. Everything begins with each person's understanding or definition of the situation that they're in. So, coming to understand how people come to hold the meanings that they do and how they use those meanings to guide their actions is essential to understanding society. And as Blumer says, meanings are shared because they're created through communication or symbolic interaction. No one person created the meanings expressed by the English language. They were created by English society as a whole. And Blumer's third premise notes that meanings are not fixed throughout an individual's life. On the contrary, as we grow older and our circumstances change, our understanding of the world we live in also changes. Everyone sees things differently at age 60 than they did at age 10 or age 20. If you haven't reached the age of 60 yet, take the word of someone who has. Blumer named his theory Symbolic Interactionism in order to emphasize that although meanings are held in the minds of individuals, they are created through interaction between people. In other words, meanings are socially created. A whole lot of people have to agree that something means something for that to become a meaning in society. Just to be able to use words, we all have to agree on what those words mean. So meaning has to be based on social cooperation at the subjective level. Shared meanings tie people together in a common culture and a common viewpoint, and so form the subjective basis for the objective cooperation which we need to do to survive. So, for Blumer, meanings are created through social cooperation. However, other theorists have criticized Blumer for being one-sided. Society does not just contain social cooperation, it also contains social conflict. And that includes conflict over meanings. Sometimes meanings are established just as much by conflict as by cooperation. Sometimes different social groups enter into a struggle over how society as a whole should define a certain word. For example, Western society has a long-standing conflict over how to define the word abortion. One side wants to define it as part of a woman's right to control over her own body. The other side wants to define it as murder. Whichever definition society accepts has profound social consequences, which is why the struggle is not always just a war of words. To paraphrase the Thomas theorem again, subjective conflict can lead to objective violence. Doctors performing abortions in North America have been threatened, attacked, had their clinics bombed, and were also arrested and imprisoned by the authorities back before abortion was legalized, and maybe again now. Those doctors, supported by the women's movement, had to fight for the right to perform abortions. And to get that right, they had to redefine how society viewed abortion. Only once they had persuaded a majority of North Americans to define abortion in positive terms was abortion legalized. So, while a society's culture does tie people together, culture is also a battleground. There's a constant struggle taking place over how society should define certain key terms. This is a struggle to decide how the average person sees the society they live in. Or in other words, it's a struggle to define social reality. And in this struggle, not all sides are equal. Some have more resources, like money and power, to bring to this struggle than others do. This means that not everyone in society gets an equal say about how things are defined. We live in a society of inequality, where the rich and powerful have the most influence over social definitions. This idea was taken up by Howard Becker. Becker was also a member of the Second Chicago School, and he became well known in the 1960s for developing what he called labeling theory. In his best-known book, Outsiders, published in 1963, Becker argued that marginal social groups, or outsiders, are often victimized by the authorities. They're given a negative label. Authority figures claim that they're a menace to society and must be stamped out. Doing so requires giving these authority figures more power and more money to get the job done. For Becker, that power and money is the real object of the exercise. The outsiders are not really a menace to society. Marginal social groups normally have neither the desire nor the resources to harm society. They're simply used by authority figures as scapegoats for society's problems and as a pretext to boost their own authority. Some such figures may genuinely believe that they have uncovered a menace to society, but most are just cynically manipulating the general public for their own benefit. Either way, the process of labeling creates a balanced form of social mobility. One social group raises its fortunes by pushing down another social group. Labeling has positive consequences for the labelers and negative consequences for the labeled. The rich and powerful become richer and more powerful by persecuting minority groups and justify this by labeling them as criminals. The process of labeling consists of the orchestration of an officially authorized witch hunt against some minority group. And I use the term witch hunt deliberately, because one of the biggest historical examples of labeling is the witch hunts of the Inquisition. In the 16th century, after being the most powerful organization in Europe for the past 1,000 years, the Catholic Church found its authority being challenged by Protestantism on one side and science on the other. So, they found a scapegoat on whom to blame all of society's problems: witches. If you got sick, or your crops failed, or anything bad happened, it was because witches were making deals with the devil and casting evil spells. And since the church was society's authority on spiritual and supernatural matters, naturally the church would have to lead the campaign to get rid of the witches, the Inquisition. Now, witches did exist and still do exist, but they were never the evil creatures that the church made them out to be. Quite the contrary, they were actually medicine women. Their witchcraft and spells were actually recipes for making herbal medicines, handed down through the generations. Before the 19th century, this was the only type of medicine there was, and the medicine woman was the only type of doctor that most villages had. But the witches were not Christian. Their traditions belonged to a religion much older than Christianity, Wicca. Wiccans did not worship a male god or a male devil because they worshipped the goddess, Mother Earth or Mother Nature. Most early religions saw the creator as female because females give birth, they create life. The idea of a male god as the supreme authority figure came along later in male-dominated religions like Christianity. Witches did not harm people, they healed people. But labeling the witches as evil monsters killed two birds with one stone for the church. It eliminated Wicca as competition for Christianity, and even more importantly, it rallied the people of Europe behind the church to fight this terrible menace. For over 200 years, the Catholic Church boosted its sagging authority by torturing and executing thousands of innocent women. The witch hunts of the Inquisition are a major historical example of labeling, but it's not taken from the work of Howard Becker. Becker was an American, so he focused on labeling in the US. He looked at several groups of outsiders in American society, such as marijuana users. First of all, he just hung out with groups of stoners and quickly came to the conclusion that there was no way in which these people were a menace to society. Stoned people are more interested in ordering a pizza than robbing a bank. They may be doing some long-term harm to their own health, but that's no reason to label them criminals. People do all kinds of things that could be harmful to their health, from driving race cars to jumping out of airplanes, and we don't lock them up for it. We respect that it is their life and their health, And if they want to risk it, that's their business, and it doesn't make them criminals. Only drug users are the exception to this rule. Unfortunately, politicians can always find some minority group, some group of outsiders, to blame all of society's problems on and to make into a terrible menace to society. They do it because the sad fact is that scare tactics work. In the words of the late great Warren Zevon, you're a whole different person when you're scared. If you can get the general public scared enough, they panic. They throw reason out the window, and they'll give you anything you ask for as long as you promise to protect them from this terrible menace. Labeling has been a route to wealth and power for a very long time, and it still is. So it's not going to go away anytime soon. Donald Trump labeled immigrants and Mexicans as a menace to white America and got himself elected president despite being Donald Trump. However, while labeling can serve the interests of the rich and powerful, it can also serve the interests of society as a whole. Some people really are violent, dangerous, and a menace to society, and they need to be labeled as criminals. Society invented labeling as a way to help recognize threats and defend itself. So, labeling can be a positive thing. But, like anything society invents, labeling can be used and it can be misused. It can be used to defend society against genuine threats, and it can be misused by authority figures to accumulate wealth and power by creating imaginary threats. But either way, one thing is clear. Labels have power. Why? Because subjective definitions have objective consequences. Labeling theory shows us that meanings and definitions are not always arrived at through simple agreement. Sometimes they are arrived at through a process of violent struggle. Sometimes they're shaped by the interests of the rich and powerful. Sometimes the general public is lied to, and minority groups have to fight for a long time to make the truth known and to redefine their social reality. In every society, meaning and culture emerge from a combination of social cooperation and social conflict. The 60s saw the rise of not just labeling theory, but also several other new subjectivist theories. Germany saw the rise of phenomenology. This was a term coined by the idealist philosopher Georg Hegel in the 1800s, revived by the philosopher Edmund Husserl in the 1900s, and the philosopher and sociologist Alfred Schutz in the 1930s, but which only became popular in sociology with the publication of Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann's The Social Construction of Reality in 1966. This text argued that social reality is not fixed or objective, but is rather a subjective reality which individuals construct just by going through their everyday routines. However, although society is subjective and is created by individuals' decisions, it comes to appear to them as something objective and external to them. Patterns of interaction become routines and norms which are then imposed on the individual. In this way, social actions become social structures. And social structures, as we saw in the talks on structuralism, provide both opportunities and restrictions. They allow us to get things done, but they can also become a trap for the individual, mental routines become taken for granted background assumptions that order our lives without our even being consciously aware of them, much less questioning them. Phenomenology is an explicitly subjectivist approach. It rejects the use of objective research in favor of introspection and the analysis of consciousness and everyday experience. It focuses on uncovering the subjective structures and background assumptions that people make to get them through their daily lives. American Harold Garfinkel studied under both Schutz and Talcott Parsons and combined their theories into the approach he called Ethnomethodology. Garfinkel retained phenomenology's focus on everyday experience and common sense knowledge, but put it in the context of larger social structures. He also rejected phenomenology's focus on introspection in favor of objective observation and even experiment. Ethnomethodology's principal method consists of the detailed observation and recording of everyday behavior. In particular, conversation analysis has demonstrated the existence of a complex system of verbal and nonverbal cues, which we all use in conversation, mostly without even realizing we're doing so. In his efforts to bring out people's hidden background assumptions, Garfinkel also had his students perform breaching experiments. Here, they would deliberately breach social conventions by acting in an unusual manner, say by being excessively polite or literal or persistent, and then observe the response. The first thing they learned was that when normal social interaction was disrupted, people would immediately try to seal the breach or re-establish the meaning of the situation by proposing explanations. Are you sick? Are you going crazy? Are you making fun of me? And so on. People need to understand what is going on around them. The second thing they learned was that disrupting people's normal social reality made them very uncomfortable and very upset. Eventually, these experiments were banned by universities, and these days you'd never get them past the ethics committee. However, Garfinkel's work has clearly demonstrated that social interaction rests on a variety of subjective structures, some of which we're not even consciously aware of. The 60s also saw the birth of exchange theory in the work of Americans George Homans and Peter Blau. Homans brought psychologist B.F. Skinner's theory of behaviorism into sociology. Skinner demonstrated that pigeons could be trained to behave as wanted through reward of desired behavior and punishment of undesired behavior. Homans applied this reward-punishment model to human behavior and human society. He argued that humans do what they're rewarded for and stop doing what they're punished for. For him, society consists primarily of reinforcement patterns, which are social structures that reward or reinforce socially desirable behavior. Homans combined Skinner's psychology with classical economics. He argued that society primarily existed to enable individuals to enter into those economic transactions which were necessary for survival. Above all, the exchange of work for goods and services. For Homans, society just consists of individuals making decisions and taking actions designed to maximize their rewards, and minimize their costs. Individuals only belong to society and follow society's rules, norms, and values as long as they are rewarded for doing so by getting the goods and services they need and are punished for breaking society's rules. The theory's focus on exchange presents society as a single, giant, but individualized marketplace. This micro-individualistic approach fits in well with Skinner's behaviorism, but critics have argued that people are not pigeon brains. Human consciousness is much more complex than that of pigeons or any other animals. Yes, costs and benefits are factors that people take into account when making their decisions, but there are many more. For example, self-sacrifice can't be explained in terms of individual rewards, but it happens all the time. On the flip side of that, when criminals get caught, they're punished in prison, but many still return to a life of crime. Reward and punishment do operate, but they don't operate deterministically. Despite its somewhat oversimplified model of human nature, exchange theory has become a significant tradition in sociology, evolving in the course of the 70s and 80s into network theory, network exchange theory, and rational choice theory. All of these theories see society as composed of individuals making choices in their rational self-interest within social exchange networks. Although they examine the macro scale of society, their main explanatory focus is on the micro scale of individual consciousness and individual decision-making. The most recent development in the subjectivist tradition is the rise of postmodernism. In sociological terms, postmodernism originated as part of the sociology of knowledge. In particular, postmodernism focuses on the ways in which social inequality and relations of power influence and shape the type of knowledge which society collects and accepts as valid. It argues that those in power only permit society at large to learn that type of knowledge which supports their privileged position. Here, the traditional subjectivist focus on how meanings are socially created has been given a critical edge. The term postmodern was invented in the 40s by the architect Joseph Hudnut, but it was only popularized in the 70s and 80s by a group of French philosophers and sociologists who called themselves post-structuralists. Their leading figures were Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-François Lyotard. Foucault began his analysis of the connection between knowledge and social structure with the common observation that knowledge is power. More precisely, Foucault argued that scientific rationality is all about domination, and that science is an instrument of social control. Truth is always located in particular social relations, so claims to truth are always attempts to establish relations of power. Every society has a type of discourse or a particular way of talking and thinking which has been largely imposed on it by those in power. Both religion and science are examples of this. Society makes this type of discourse or rationality work in practice because it has to in order to survive. But Foucault argued that that doesn't make it true. Where Foucault used the term discourse, Derrida used the term text. He argued that everything we know just consists of texts or linguistic accounts. He went so far as to say, there is nothing outside the text. He also argued that over time we play with language, meaning that we interpret and reinterpret it. The meaning of a text is therefore open-ended and keeps changing, since it's established partly by the reader and is therefore partly dependent on the reader's changing social context. There is no ultimately correct interpretation of any text, including that of the author. This position has even been called the death of the author. Where Derrida used the term text, Lyotard used the term narrative. He argued that all knowledge just consists of multiple narratives with which we then play language games. These varied narratives cannot be reduced into a single meta-narrative or truth because they are heteromorphous, which means that they all work by different rules. Today in the Western world, we live in the postmodern condition, which means that we're all bombarded by so many different narratives that it's impossible to tie them all into a single truth. Instead, we should embrace a diversity of viewpoints, or many different truths. These theorists established the philosophical foundation of postmodernism. However, postmodernism has spread into a number of disciplines, beginning with Hudnut's architectural analysis and continuing with the linguistic theories of Ferdinand de Saussure and the anthropology of Claude Lévi-Strauss, among others. Sociology is just one more discipline which has felt the effects of this intellectual movement. Some brief comments on postmodernism. First of all, in another talk, I accused structuralist Talcott Parsons of terminological inflation, or big words for small ideas, making up his own long-winded terminology to make his ideas sound more impressive. This accusation applies doubly to postmodernism. I have not defined made-up postmodernist terms like phonologism, logocentrism, or supplementarity, and I'm not going to. Look them up if you really care. As far as I'm concerned, they spread far more confusion than clarity. Let me give you just one example. In 1998, theoretical physicist Alan Sokal decided to debunk postmodernism. So, he created an academic hoax. He wrote an article which consisted of a series of sentences written in postmodernist jargon, but put together at random. In other words, he deliberately produced an article of academic-sounding gibberish. This article was accepted as a serious submission and published in the postmodernist journal Social Text. Sokal then asked the question, if even the editors of a postmodernist journal can't tell the difference between postmodernism and pure gibberish, then is there actually any difference? And even if there is, what use is it if nobody can understand it? Personally, I don't trust any made-up terminology. As far as I'm concerned, if you can't say it in plain English, then you're just trying to baffle people with bullshit. My second, more substantive criticism of postmodernism is that the term and the concept are based on a lie. The term postmodernism implies an approach that comes after modernism, an approach that is more modern than modern, that is the latest thing. And indeed, it is the latest thing in the social sciences. But there's nothing new about postmodernism except the jargon. On the contrary, postmodernism is just an updated version of the theory of relativism first put forward in the 16th century by philosophers like Michel de Montaigne. Relativism may be summed up in the saying, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. Since everybody has a different opinion, establishing universal truths is impossible. All truth is relative to the viewpoint of the individual or group or society which declares that truth. Moreover, since these viewpoints not only all differ but also all change over time, there can be no universal or eternal truths. While some postmodernists have denied that they are relativists, I think it's easy to see that the basic ideas put forward by Montaigne and others in the 16th century are very similar to the ideas put forward by Foucault and others in the 20th century. The problem with relativism is that it is subject to what's been called the paradox of self-referentiality, which is that if you apply relativism to itself, it becomes self-contradictory. Relativism sets up the principle that everything is relative, so there are no universal truths, as a universal truth. If everyone is entitled to their own opinion, then I am entitled to the opinion that relativism and postmodernism are complete nonsense, and their supporters can't even argue against me. If nothing is true, then we don't have a reason in the world to believe that postmodernism is true. In practice, society needs generally accepted truths to survive. A thoroughgoing application of the principle that everyone is right for themselves would lead to complete chaos. Such radical individualization would lead to a breakdown of all norms, values, and social structures. Society would cease to exist, and we'd all starve to death. Now, I'm pretty sure that postmodernism will never be influential enough to do that. Nevertheless, it is influential in some intellectual circles, including sociology. The reason for this, I would argue, is information overload. Thanks to the electronic media in general and the internet in particular, we live in an age in which every individual is bombarded with vastly more information than in any previous age. Some intellectuals have given up on trying to make sense of all this information and sorting truth from falsehood, and have simply declared that everyone's right for themselves. I would argue that this makes postmodernism into no more than a cry of intellectual despair. Having failed to find the needle of truth in a haystack of rhetoric, they proclaim that it doesn't exist. Since they haven't found it, it can't be found, and we should all stop looking. However, despite the ongoing popularity of postmodernism, there are still some of us old-fashioned academics who believe that it's our job to uncover the truth, not just somebody's truth. Sociology is a social science, and the job of science is to uncover universal truths, not individual opinions. This is why postmodernism is a philosophical theory, but it is not a scientific one. If everyone is right and nobody's wrong, then the whole scientific project becomes meaningless. Indeed, if everyone has their own truth, then the whole concept of truth becomes meaningless. Since that would make my whole life as an academic and my life's work meaningless, it is not a theory that I will ever accept. In conclusion, we've seen that the subjectivist tradition focuses on the self or mind at the micro level and on meaning or culture at the macro level. We've also seen that neither of these levels can exist without the other. A culture cannot exist without the millions of individual minds that make it up, but the self cannot come into existence unless the individual is socialized into the larger culture. Every self is created as a microcosm of its culture. Socialization subjectively connects the micro level of society to the macro level. Both are equally important and equally necessary to the understanding of society. For subjectivists, society is subjective. Society is, of course, affected by objective things like our needs for food and shelter, but in itself, society consists of social relationships, which are subjective. Society exists in our minds. Society exists only because we know it exists. If all of Canada woke up tomorrow with amnesia, nothing would have changed objectively, yet Canadian society would have literally ceased to exist overnight simply because nobody would remember what it means to be Canadian. Society as a whole is the ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy. It exists because we say it exists. That concludes my look at the history of subjectivism. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day all.